So new leaked phone calls appear to show that Steve Witkoff was coaching the Russians on how to get what they want out of Trump in the Russia-Ukraine peace negotiations. Now, plenty of folks are calling this treason, framing Witkoff's actions as betraying the United States in favor of Russia. Now, that's a pretty serious allegation, and I'll leave that determination up to the legal-minded folks, but I can confidently say that this is, at the very least, awful for U.S. national security. So let's get into what we know. Hey, I'm coming at you from a hotel room here in Austin, Texas, down here for a couple days, seeing family for the Thanksgiving holiday. For everyone around the United States or all Americans abroad, happy Thanksgiving. For those of you that don't celebrate this or this isn't a national holiday, think of coming over at some point around this time of year. It's a lot of fun. Friends and family, lots of food. Overall, pretty solid holiday. Now, the negotiations continue between Russia and Ukraine throughout this holiday weekend. The Guardian, reporting on these new leaked phone calls between Witkoff and his Russian counterparts, said Don Bacon, a Republican representative, called for Steve Witkoff's immediate dismissal. Quote, "For those who oppose the Russian invasion and want to see Ukraine prevail as a sovereign and democratic country, it is clear that Witkoff fully favors the Russians. He cannot be trusted to lead these negotiations. Would a Russian paid agent do less than he? He should be fired." Another Republican, Brian Fitzpatrick from Pennsylvania, wrote that the leak represented, quote, "a major problem and one of the many reasons why these ridiculous sideshows and secret meetings need to stop." He urged the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, to be allowed to, quote, "do his job in a fair and objective manner." Put me in that camp, by the way. I'll share some personal opinions here in a minute, but this is Rubio needs to be leading this start to finish with professionals from the State Department. The fact that we are going at this with people not familiar with Russia, not familiar with the diplomatic process, is pretty evident at this point, and we are handicapping ourselves unnecessarily. Democratic Representative Ted Lieu went a bit further, calling Witkoff, quote, "an actual traitor," saying Witkoff is supposed to work for the United States and not Russia. Now, diving into the actual phone calls, there were two leaked transcripts published by Bloomberg. I'll publish those articles in the description below for anybody interested. The following was part of a transcript on October 14th. There was a phone call between Witkoff, Trump's special envoy for peace missions, and Yuri Ushakov, Putin's most senior foreign policy advisor, where Witkoff says, quote, "here's one more thing. Zelensky is coming to the White House on Friday." Yushakov says, "I know that," as he laughs. Witkoff said, "I will go to that meeting because they want me there, but I think if possible, we should have the call with your boss before that Friday meeting." Yushakov says, Before, yeah. And Witkoff says, "correct." Now, that meeting back in October there was a lot of speculation leading up to that the United States may actually provide Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine that would have a significant impact on the battlefield. Instead, that meeting went south from the get-go. The phone call with Putin right before Zelensky stepped into the office may have something to do with that. In fact, the New York Times reports Russian dictator Vladimir Putin threatened President Trump not to send Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine in a phone call set in motion by White House Special Envoy Steve Witkoff ahead of a high-stakes meeting with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. With Zelensky scheduled to visit the White House the next day, Putin made the October 16th call just as Trump was giving serious consideration to arming Ukraine with long-range Tomahawk missiles to ramp up pressure on Moscow. And I should note, that pressure on Moscow throughout this entire peace negotiations, it's still not there. Like, that is the lever that we continue to not pull. This time, it looked like that was actually going to happen. But this phone call set up between Putin and Trump, organized by Witkoff before that meeting, seems to have tanked it. They say the critical Putin-Trump call came after Witkoff suggested to Yushakov that Putin ingratiate himself with the U.S. president by stroking his ego on achieving the Gaza ceasefire deal about a week before, according to the Bloomberg transcript. Putin was able to use the call to successfully talk Trump out of sending the long-range weapons, after Witkoff coached Ushakov on what Putin should tell the U.S. president to convince him that Russia was ready to end the war in Ukraine, despite Moscow's unwillingness to make any concessions. They didn't make any concessions then. They didn't make any concessions in or around the Alaska meeting. They haven't made any concessions now. That is the one standard that we have from the Russian side of negotiations throughout. Now, a couple of thoughts here, and there's a lot more to unpack, but first off, I would not expect Witkoff to be removed. Trump was asked about this. We have a statement from the White House here in a moment, but by and large, Trump said there's nothing there. He said he hasn't seen the transcripts. He doesn't know what took place during this actual call. But if we look back at the first Trump administration, there were a lot of firings, a lot of people let go, and that was generally viewed as chaos, understandably so, inside of the White House. And it was used to criticize Trump and say he's clearly not that effective of a leader if he is hiring these people and then firing them. Also, a lot of the people he was letting go served in prior administrations and had spent a lot of time in the State Department, the White House, National Security Council, Defense. So folks looked at that from the outside in saying, how are all of these people that kind of help run a functioning government, Trump doesn't get along with them, Trump can't function with them, that's a Trump problem at some point, right? So kind of we've seen a veer in the polar opposite direction in Trump 2.0, where they're really not firing anybody at all. At all. I mean, I would argue that somebody probably should have been let go at the very least for those signal leaked chats around the Houthi strikes months ago. Mike Waltz, the national security advisor, kind of maybe, but he was moved to the UN ambassador in what the administration hailed as a promotion. So like from what I can remember, that's the closest thing, at least in the foreign policy circles, for anybody being fired or removed. So in this case, I would not expect Witkoff to be removed. In fact, what I would expect is, as we're seeing right now, a lot of framing that this is a partisan effort to try to slander Witkoff or kind of undermine the peace process rather than what it actually is, which is just straight up sloppy and awful that we have people like Witkoff leading these negotiations. This is arguably one of the most, if not the most significant set of negotiations the United States has taken part in what, at least the last 20 plus years? And we have Witkoff maybe discussing major diplomatic issues over unsecured lines. Like, unforgivably sloppy. That is the stuff you would not expect from a junior diplomat fresh out of college. And here we have the lead negotiator probably just talking to a number, unknowingly, or actually knowingly, talking to a number of security agencies around the world that are intercepting that call, which leads to the question of who actually leaked this phone call, because we don't have that information. The Wall Street Journal put together a piece on this saying, quote, a senior Trump administration official said he believed the call was leaked by a foreign intelligence agency and that the target wasn't Witkoff, but Ushakov, who was also recorded in a second conversation with another Kremlin envoy, Dmitriev. What they're getting at there is the phone number or the device that was being monitored was not Witkoff's. So it was not a foreign intelligence agency necessarily spying directly on the U.S., although that does happen. We spy on them, they spy on us, more on that in a second. But that the target of these intercepts was Russia, which does make a lot of sense. They say a European security official said that dozens of countries around the world had the technology to listen to Ushakov's conversations as the Kremlin official was using an open cell phone line. His main suspect, this European security official, likely to be a European country, but he didn't know who exactly. Then again, he added, Russia couldn't be ruled out because there are divisions and infighting over Dmitriev's role as the Kremlin go-between. Here's the thing. It could have been anybody. We're talking about an open cell line. Russia could have intercepted it. They could have just straight up been recording the call. The United States could have intercepted it. Any number of European countries. It doesn't take a lot of fancy technology to be able to intercept an open phone line, especially when you know the number and the phone that those calls are going to be coming from. Again, incredibly sloppy that Witkoff is communicating at all over those communications. This is the type of mistake. It doesn't matter who. You're going to see a lot of focus on who leaked it. And to a degree, that does matter. We want to find out because that kind of speaks to the narratives. But any number of people, I mean, this was right out there in the open for anybody to grab onto. And something that I wouldn't discount entirely quite yet is the possibility that this may have been leaked from someone in the United States. There is some infighting here as well. What we're seeing emerge in the last couple days here is Rubio talking about how this is not a U.S. plan. We're going to get to that here in a second. That this was the Russian plan. He told that to some U.S. senators. And then you have people like President Trump and Vice President Vance coming down hard in favor of this specific 28-point plan that's now generally been scrapped. But you're seeing some divisions between what I would say are Driscoll and Vance, the Army Secretary that kind of all of a sudden is leading negotiations, and Rubio and more kind of traditional neocon representatives in the U.S. government. So there's a division here as well. I wouldn't put it past people in the United States to maybe have leaked this as well to sow some division and kind of throw Witkoff under the bus, which, look, no fan of Witkoff. He should have been removed long ago. If this leads to his sidelining, that is probably a net benefit for the United States and our national security in these negotiations. Part of the challenge here is just the chaos. We're quoting Tatiana Statinova, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center, that I thought did a great job laying out exactly the problems that this has all brought about, where she said Moscow faces a serious structural problem. Who should they actually talk to on the American side? Witkoff is convenient and receptive to Russian ideas, yeah, but he's bureaucratically isolated and politically fragile. He takes well-known Russian positions, repackages them, and watches them die almost immediately. Trump refuses to dive into details. Rubio is unenthusiastic about Russian input and struggles to find common ground with Lavrov. Passing proposals through Witkoff may feel tactically easy, but it lacks any real weight. The latest leaks only exacerbate this weakness. As for Driscoll, the U.S. Army Secretary, which I just want to say, Driscoll has done a good job as Army Secretary. He's had some great initiatives, I think, personally, and getting a lot of praise from inside the service and out. It looks like he's doing a great job and was an excellent pick. He all of a sudden, this is very unusual for the Army Secretary, all of a sudden, at the drop of a hat, to be leading peace negotiations. There is no way to spin that as like a normal thing. It is very unusual. They say, as for Driscoll, he arrived in Abu Dhabi rather naively, hoping to speak to his Russian counterparts. He left empty-handed because he simply wasn't talking to the right people. The Kremlin still doesn't know what capacity he is acting in or what mandate he actually carries. I get it. Neither do we. Driscoll just kind of like appeared on the scene and all of a sudden he's there talking. What's going on? Like, does he have the president's ear? Is he speaking for Witkoff? Is he part of the Witkoff-Kushner team? Is he, more representing Vance? He famously has a long-standing relationship with Vance. That's arguably one of the reasons he was picked to be the Army Secretary. What's going on here? So if you're the Russians, again, who are you talking to? Who is your main point of contact? And we are seeing rifts within, between Rubio and Vance and Witkoff and Kushner and Driscoll. So if you're the Russians, you can understand the confusion of, like, I don't know exactly who we should be prioritizing here. Tatiana adds to it here saying, Moscow genuinely doesn't know what document they are even talking about. Is it the 28 points or the 19-point plan? The 19-point paper itself is not finalized because Zelensky still needs to raise a couple of those issues directly with Trump. They say the Kremlin wants an official written text with clear status it can work with. For now, they are simply waiting. And that would, I think, kind of drive home my personal opinion right now that there's a lot of talk that these peace plans, that we're very close or we're on the verge of a breakthrough. And I just don't think that's the case. It's not clear from the Russian perspective what they're even negotiating with right now. Europe kind of had something and then that fell off and they said they're actually going to go with this 19-point plan. There's the 28-point plan that, again, more information, a second leak, seems to be just straight up a Russian proposal. The idea that we are close to something seems a bit far-fetched. Now, this second leak came out, Slate talking about it, said the transcript of a follow-on phone conversation between two Kremlin advisors discussing the Witkoff call, also published by Bloomberg, confirms that the 28-point peace plan, which Witkoff put on the table last week, was in fact largely a Kremlin product designed to favor Russia's position. I feel like that shouldn't be a surprise at all. Anybody who read that thing, and we went through it point by point, or at least calling out some of the major points a few days ago, yeah, that was very clearly just a Russian plan. Stephen Chung, the White House comms director, in response to this, said, quote, "This story only proves that Steve Witkoff talks to officials in both Russia and Ukraine nearly every day to achieve peace, which is exactly what President Trump appointed him to do." And I should note, that 28-point peace plan, this is one where I'm a little hard-pressed to decide how far we need to dig into this. Like, again, I think that it should have just been brushed aside right out the gate with somebody from the United States saying, yeah, that's the Russian plan. What do you want from us? Like, we're going to accept the Russian plan, we're going to look at it, we're going to mark it up, and we're going to talk to Ukraine, serve as the mediator here and say, this is their plan, let's talk about it. But no, that's not the path we took. The path we took was to dig in and say, this is ours. And there's some real problems with that. President Trump, just 2 days ago on the 25th, in a long Truth Social post, kind of right in the middle there, said, quote, "The original 28-point peace plan, which was drafted by the United States, has been fine-tuned with additional input from both sides. And we've seen numerous officials, from the vice president to the White House press secretary and others, kind of go to the mat saying this is ours. We put this together, claiming ownership of what, to be blunt, is a really bad plan for the United States. We talked about this a couple days ago. Not only did the plan volunteer that NATO would no longer expand at all. There's a separate segment for Ukraine saying Ukraine will not join NATO. Outside of that, it just ceded the NATO alliance to Russia and said, you know what? That's it. We'll call it quits here for the alliance, which is a pretty wild thing to give into, considering that NATO isn't actually fighting a war. Wild that NATO would surrender in a war that they're not fighting. But nonetheless, Michael Weiss and Christo Grozev, in an article for The Insider, talked about some of the details here that are even crazier. They say the 28-point plan adopted by the Trump White House for ending the war in Ukraine, allegedly written by American negotiators with input from Russia, is in fact at its core a recycled Russian document that The Insider was shown several months ago by a source close to the Russian government. In part of it, quote, $100 billion in frozen Russian assets will be invested in U.S.-led efforts to rebuild and invest in Ukraine. The U.S. will receive 50% of the profits from the venture. Europe will add $100 billion to increase the amount of investment available for Ukraine's reconstruction. Frozen European funds will be unfrozen. The Russian source said, quote, the oligarchs will still get a chance to get their returns as investors in Ukraine. In other words, these assets would not be lost, but merely redirected into future business opportunities to enrich Putin's billionaire cronies. They also cited a couple sweeteners that were added into this deal, that the United States would invest in Russia's post-war economy, which was expected to be in a cash-strapped and dire mode in need of investment. They said the source explained that this would usher in a new era for U.S.-Russian inward investment similar to the 1990s. So again, a couple key components where you're trying to figure out, like, wait a minute, what? When people say that this plan was largely in favor of Russia, it's opening up Russian investment alongside U.S. investment into Ukrainian reconstruction after the war. That's pretty wild, right? And then the U.S. saying we're just going to straight up invest in Russia after this. There's a lot of places around the world where the United States could invest and grow relationships and see a very positive and mutually beneficial return. Russia is not towards the top of that list. They just aren't. There's a lot of places we could spend that time and energy. So again, very clearly a heavily pro-Russia document that Michael Weiss here, we'll link that in the description below as well, kind of lays out. This is just straight up the Russian plan that for some unknown reason, and you know what, I'm not going to say unknown reason. My belief here is that we have this toxic situation right now in American politics where it is better to defend something bad than to acknowledge a mistake. I think in this case, it was a mistake. Witkoff and Kushner, again, because they are not surrounded by professional diplomats that can read this and say, hey, that's an awful idea to pitch that as ours. It's okay to pitch that as Russia's. It's a bad idea to pitch that as ours. They don't have the right people around them to say that right now. They've all sidelined them and gone in favor of this kind of outsider type approach, which I got it. I think there's a place for that. But if we're going to do that, we also need to be flexible enough to say it's not working. We need to change on the go, and we aren't doing that part. So my view is that there was a mistake made here. The Russian plan was presented as our own, either out of laziness or malice or whichever direction you want to go. And rather than say this was a mistake, we are adjusting course, we have multiple people digging in saying, no, this is actually ours. And now it looks like the United States interests are directly aligned with Russia's, which is why you're seeing pushback from even Republican members of Congress saying, what on earth are you guys even doing here? Now, the Russian response, by and large, there's a part of this where it doesn't really even matter, because the Russian response so far has been, we are not going to negotiate on any of our key demands. The Russian deputy foreign minister just yesterday said, quote, there can be no question of any concessions of Russia's key approaches to the context of the special military operation, as in no bend at all. Russia has started to present any ceasefire at all as simply allowing Europe the opportunity to rebuild and rearm and prepare for war with Russia. I think most of the audience here is English-speaking, Western in nature, Western Europe and the United States, and you hear that and you go, what? Europe is preparing for a war in Russia? They're not. We're not. That's not been on the table, like, at all. But that's part of the fear that Russia has used, the necessity that they say to go to war. They're preempting this, what would be a U.S.-led NATO war against Russia. They're right back to that now, saying we can't have a ceasefire because that will allow the United States and Europe to build up and invade Russia. Again, also in line with that, we're seeing a lot of kind of increased confidence by Russia on the battlefield. They are making progress in a couple key areas. Just a few days ago, we went over some battlefield updates as to where they are progressing from Kupiansk to Seversk, Zaporizhia, and of course in Pokrovsk. Minor gains, all things considered, but they are looking at that right now and saying, why would we negotiate? We have the upper hand. We are on track to achieve all of our objectives on the battlefield militarily. They're not. It's going to take a long, long time to get there, but we are seeing more and more calls from inside of Russia saying these negotiations don't really matter. We don't need to do this. We're going to get where we need to anyway. So again, when looking at all of this, I think it's important to dig through the details. I don't know that we're actually moving towards any viable ceasefire or long-term peace negotiations, but nonetheless, that's about where things stand today. Again, for everyone in the United States or Americans abroad celebrating this holiday, happy Thanksgiving. To everyone else, have a great Thursday and weekend. That's all we got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.